Hey, DT, right. We've assembled pretty quickly on this one. It's a bit of a far from being over the horizon. This is a very reactive podcast, but I think literally 40 minutes ago, news started hitting the wires about Rachel Reeves, who's been scrutinized in the press before over her earlier career. But today's story and stories are really interesting to look at, especially from the point of view of us at Skadi, because as I read through it, it is absolutely, it's textbook whistleblow investigation.
Yep.
Because what I love about reading this is there's a time context. Everything that's happening in these allegations is around, in the heart of the financial crisis. There's, it's bad timing, if you like, or, difficult timing. There's, it's to do with expenses, and anyone in investigations in a financial institution will, freely admit that that expenses form such a large part of any investigative book of work, not by value, but just by amount of hours spent on stuff, because it is an area of risk and ambiguity. There's policy, there's a bit of tax in here. There's all kinds of things, Damian. So I just think we both looked at it and we thought, crikey, this is a great one to have a chat about, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, so it's driven by this BBC. So BBC have broken the story, and actually, as I was reading through it and then sent it to you to read, I was like, this is a long story, and which shows they've obviously made sure all the ducks align and they've got all their facts straight before they published it. It's not just a sort of quick, we've done a bit of work and here we go. Here's a sort of 3 paragraphs on it. It's a proper investigation that they've done.
Well, I think you also make the point that it is a long story, but slightly blowing our own trumpets here, we've been able to respond to this so quickly on the podcast because we've seen quite a lot of this. We see a lot of this in what we do at Skadi, in the way we help institutions in their investigations area. So anyway, if you and I can't believe anyone hasn't, but if they haven't heard or seen the Rachel Reeves story, so Rachel Reeves, of course, is the UK's Chancellor, and already there has been scrutiny over her CV, if you like, in the last year, particularly because she had or has touted herself as an economist from the Bank of England. She has bandied around the phrase decade at the Bank of England as well. And I think a lot of that's been looked at and questioned, but seems to have kind of weathered that storm. But it's reemerged again today with allegations that she was the subject of an investigation into her use of expenses while working at Halifax Bank of Scotland. So if we just let's go back, we always do a timeline in an investigation, Damian. And I'm conscious, and I'm not throwing you under the bus here. You actually haven't done an investigation with Skadi yet, have you? Your work has always been on the audit side.
Audit side. And actually, the bit that I read that thought was interesting was the fact, and you will know a bit about this, obviously having worked on investigations. The whistleblower was done and the investigation was passed to internal audit. Now, from what I hear from you, investigations doesn't always sit in internal audit. I mean, my dealing has been with internal audit.
Well, I think that's a time thing. Right. We are back in 2008.
True, yeah.
And the investigation functions in the kind of form that we know today, and there are not just one investigation function within a financial institution, a large one. There may be a number of them, and in fact, they'll take their investigations to a triage forum to decide who's best equipped for this particular investigation. But I think if you go back in time, and in fact, you and I helped on an investigation way back in the day that was handled by internal audit at the institution, because internal audit, it looks like an investigation area, an area that could do investigations, and a lot of what internal audit does is investigatory. And actually, if you are in a smaller place, and you don't have the resources to devote or need to devote to a full-time investigation function, yes, it could well be carried out by internal audit. It could be carried out by compliance. It really depends.
Yeah.
But in this case, it was carried out by internal audit. But in any case, so looking back at the timeline, Rachel Reeves was, and it says on her LinkedIn, which has now been corrected, but at the time of the BBC article, it said that she was at the Bank of England from September 2000 until December 2006. And that's interesting because obviously that's just over 6 years. So the decade at the Bank of England is with a lot of artistic license. I often sort of say I had 10 years at ING Bearings when I actually was 9 years and 6 months.
Okay, I think that's...
So I give her...
That round off is loud.
I give her a bit of a pass, but when I found out it was 6 years, I couldn't really give her a pass on that one. But she is shown in photographs being at Halifax Bank of Scotland in March 2006. So, and again, that's another sort of interesting thing where I feel like she's a little bit banged to rights on this one. But to give the ambiguity and the balance, I do think what happens to people in banking is there's a lot of use of garden leave.
Yeah.
There's a lot of making people stay at home or keeping them employed while not functionally useful, if you like. Mm-hmm. Something that she probably cares a lot about in her role at Chancellor, trying to get people back into work. So there is a lot of, confusion. And often when you're made redundant, there's, what is my leaving date?
Yeah.
Is it when I was kicked out the door? Oh, I've got notice. But then you sign a compromise agreement where they'll pay you up front, for your notice period. And so your notice is brought earlier. There's all kinds of ambiguity there. So could I give her a pass on it? Maybe. I'll give it a maybe pass on that one, but not the decade. So from March 2006 to May 2009, and that's on her LinkedIn now, you have her working at Halifax Bank of Scotland. And until late 2007, she was working in the mortgages area, and then moves to be head of business planning in customer relations, which is an area that handles complaints. And the whistleblow complaint, or the allegations, are detailed in a 6-page complaint with attached evidence. So, that sounds to me like there's quite a bit of specificity around what's being alleged.
Yeah.
But it's around 3 senior managers, using the bank's money to, in inverted commas, fund a lifestyle. And that's inappropriate spending, including gifts for each other. So that sounds terrible, sounds awfully damning. But I think with, what if this is where it gets really interesting into the kind of, whenever you see whistleblow allegations, or when I have seen whistleblow allegations, and now after a decade of working with investigation functions, I've seen a few. And I've seen a whole plethora of specificity. I've seen really specific allegations. Yeah. And they generally, if someone is so specific around stuff, then, that means they really have witnessed something. And of course, it makes the investigations team work so much easier because you've got something to go on.
Yeah.
I have seen very plausible allegations, but where examples of what could be the behavior is alleged rather than what has been witnessed, if anything has been witnessed. And that's kind of, difficult in itself, because of course you're looking at saying, well, this could happen. But again, you're asking yourself the question, well, if this has happened, why? Where is the specific example? And of course, people working in the whistleblowing area will be asking the reporter for detail to try and understand what they've seen so that they can investigate it and look at it. So there is a bit of dialogue. And that dialogue, it's interesting because people are anonymized.
Yeah, I was about to say. So there's a whole
so it's done through
behind it.
Well, exactly. So it's done through a kind of Dropbox, if you like, functionality that protects their identities. They don't have to reveal who they are if they don't choose to. And that obviously helps in terms of trust and enabling them to speak freely, you'd hope. But people are mistrustful and they choose not to. Or actually, they also may not be, in possession of facts, so are unable to actually back up what they are saying. So there could be speculation. There's the whole sort of panoply, if you like. And then I have also seen where really the allegation is kind of really quite broad, and also kind of almost you then start looking around, you find out that actually a lot of it's been written in the press,
right?
And it's not really new allegations, and they're kind of manufacturing something from something they've seen. So, but I think it's fair to say that in this case, why on earth would there be articles written about Rachel Reeves in accounts in 2008? I don't think so at this point.
Yes.
So it also, like, looking at what is behind this spending, and this is again the ambiguity, and there's without fail ambiguity in the vast majority of whistleblow complaints that I've had to work on or looked at. It's always really difficult. It's a real challenge for investigation functions, and in this case, there's an HBOS initiative involving what's known as motivation cards, and these are effectively it's a payment system, thank you card, and it's loaded up with £25 per direct report. And this is so that managers can give their staff a gift for going the extra mile in their jobs. And of course, you can imagine working in the area that handles complaints. That's not an easy place to work. Yep. That's pretty thankless. Now, these may have been bank-wide. We don't know. We weren't working in the bank at this time. It'd be interesting to know, and we haven't had time to find out. But you can imagine that actually, that there would be occasions where it would go a long way with your employees if they've had really, dealt with something probably quite challenging, but have got a good outcome for the bank and for the customer. Then I can see that would be, a good way of looking after your staff. And it seems that the £25 limit is driven by tax advice.
Yeah.
So, there's obviously HMRC have permitted £25 per employee to be gifted. And they've chosen in this way to use this and give this out via these motivation cards. Now, in February 2008, there's a guidance memo that really states what the correct use is. So these cards have been in use beforehand.
Yes, we don't know when they came along.
We don't know when they came along, but certainly by February 2008, there's a sort of updated guidance on their correct use, which, looking at the BBC article, there is email correspondence sort of challenging some of the things that's written, because it doesn't seem to be the status quo, or this is almost like news to people using the initiative versus how they're used to using it. If you look at the specific allegations around what is supposed to have happened, then Rachel Reeves has spent £400 on a leaving meal for a colleague, which was spent on the motivation card. Now, obviously, £400 is in clear breach of £25 limit. But again, you've got to kind of ask yourself the question, well, if it's loaded up with £25 per employee and you've got a team of people there that haven't been necessarily rewarded by the bank, and you've chosen as a manager to, in one fell swoop, do everybody, if you like, then I can sort of see how that could happen. and I could see it being, ambiguous.
Yeah, it was on a leaving meal, but maybe that would have been expensed anyway, and maybe it just became easier that there was credit on your card. You said, well, actually, I'll spend it on this because then I don't have to go through this rigmarole of putting in expenses, whatever. So yeah, you're right that
that's a really interesting point, Damian, because people find often, the path of least resistance, because, like you say, they probably feel that they could expense this leaving meal, but maybe it's a lot of paperwork. And actually, do you know what? The motivation cards are there.
Yeah,
let's just go for it. Or the flip side is they possibly wouldn't have been able to have expensed it and thought, oh, do you know, let's just bang it on the motivation card.
Yeah.
Because we don't want to pay for it ourselves as we should.
Yeah.
We don't know what the policy is around, leaving meals. And it's, that's an interesting, again, it's the ambiguity. And you encounter this time after time in investigations. There are also instances documented of her buying birthday presents for the team members. That sounds nice to me, to be honest. I think she would, she's like a nice person to work with. But also, these were either bought with the card. The what do we call it?
Motivation card.
The motivation card. So motivate you to have more birthdays. The motivation card, but also separately bought and then claimed back from the bank. So the bank obviously has tolerance at that time for paying for staff's birthday presents. So could it come through
£25? But I think,
but you're right again. It's on that £25 limit.
But also, I think there's been an edict that you cannot buy gifts for other people with your £25 motivation voucher.
But hang on, you bring up a voucher.
Well,
I thought this was a card that the manager goes out and spends for their employees.
Yes.
And again, we're not first hand here, so we don't know. Maybe this will all come out in the press in the next few days and become, easier to understand. But it sounds as though you're buying these for people to then present them with, and you're keeping it under a limit.
Under the limit, yeah.
But again, to your point, there's some documented ambiguity because people were spending £50, £75 over this £25 limit. So it doesn't sound like the £25 limit was articulated before the February 2008 guidance memo, I would say.
Yeah.
And it could well be the case that, this wasn't well understood within the bank about the £25 limit because it just may never have been stated. And so people didn't understand. And also maybe the bank wasn't subject to scrutiny until February 2008 as well. And that's something we'll come to, which is the scrutiny around the bank at this time, because everyone will remember 2008. We know what was going on. It was the global financial crisis and things changed.
Yes, there's a lot going on in the background. Yeah.
The other thing, though, as well, is that Rachel Reeves and a colleague, a senior manager, spent £152 on a handbag and some perfume with the bank's money for one of their friends, their colleagues.
Yeah.
And this seems to have been part of the investigation as well. Then there's also documented an October 2008, and again, that timing I think is really interesting, October 2008, saying it's still standard to use motivation cards for Christmas gifts for staff. And I again, as this is a tax benefit, maybe there's a drive that if you haven't, if such a Damien, you've been useless this year, but go on, we can't motivate him. Let's buy him a Christmas gift just to get the thing spent.
Yeah,
I don't know, but that sounds interesting, and it's also that ambiguity because when you've got decisions on spending driven by tax breaks as opposed to really what they're for. And then a kind of a year-end push to make sure we spend them so we get the benefit, because finance is saying we've got to spend this stuff. Then it mucks up, people's understanding about policies and why they're doing things. And again, that's another interesting area of investigations, because you're always trying to understand staff's motivation, or custodians' motivation. Why would they do the activity that's been alleged? What would be behind it? And is that motivation innocent? Is it nefarious? What are the reasons? Is it an error? And I can see here that there's scope for misunderstanding. There's scope for error. But I think there's also possibility, for abuse, whether it's knowing or not. So looking at the timeline, and as you've already explained, internal audit investigated the whistleblower complaint on Rachel Reeves and two other senior managers, and they delivered a finding in April 2009. Rachel Reeves leaves the bank in May 2009, and it seems that she was never interviewed for these allegations.
Yes.
That's interesting, because obviously if you've got a finding,
the expectation is it would be followed up.
Well, you can't just do a finding on someone and not give them a chance to answer the allegations, and also hear their side, or and explain what's going on here. So that's interesting, and certainly Rachel Reeves' team, in inverted commas, and you can imagine what that team would be, are saying, well, that these allegations were never put to her. If we look at the circumstances of her departure from the bank in May 2009, we can see evidence that she's a good leaver, or considered a good leaver. Why do we think that? Well, she got to keep the company car for 6 months. You don't give someone use of the company car if they're a bad leaver. Crikey. They're kind of marched out and they've got to leave everything on the desk. Not quite the company car, but certainly the keys. They would have to. So I think that's interesting. And there was a compromise agreement signed, which forms obviously some form of NDA, which happens in these circumstances. So that's the whole sort of scope of what's being alleged. Really interesting. Going back in the timeline, Damian. So Halifax Bank of Scotland, how did they come to be? Do you recall? Because I think we looked at this in our career, mate.
We did. I think we might even have traded it as an ARB.
I think we had the pair on, and we probably got carried out.
I'm sure we did. No, I think it was fun. That was 01. I can't remember the month actually, but it was 2001. They merged. Both were listed entities, and I think it was a classic sort of share swap one for the other. But so yes, it had been around for a few years by 08, and then I assume this is where you're going with the story. There's quite a lot that goes on in 08, and it is forced into the hands of Lloyds as part of the financial crisis, and it is the Bank of England and FCA basically force it through without having to go through competition rules.
Oh wow!
To ensure that it survived, and that bailout money was involved, but I think the point was you were using Lloyds' stronger balance sheet to take over HBOS. So that is the backdrop to a lot of what is going on here. So you think there's edicts coming around about spending in December of 08. I think the merger was agreed in September. And didn't finalise till January.
Announced September. We know what happened in September. The Noble House of Lehman went down, right? Noble House of Lehman went down. And I say noble because I worked there. Not at the time, but, I'll give it that pass. People wouldn't necessarily say Lehman was so noble. But, September 2008, obviously the markets just went into complete lockup. Yeah. And certain portions of the market absolutely into lockup. And it was a terrifying time for institutions, terrifying time for central bankers and regulators and politicians. There was an unseemly scramble to look at where were the weak spots. You've got Northern Rock has also gone down.
Yeah.
Which certainly comparative to the old Halifax business of being a building society converted into this some kind of financial powerhouse. HBOS, was their business all that different from Northern Rock? Probably not. I do remember it I remember the articles from 2001 where, Bank of Scotland, talked about as this jewel in the crown, and how the Scottish banks were really showing the way. And obviously, Royal Bank of Scotland as well became very powerful by 2008. It was very, very powerful.
I think at one point it was the largest market cap bank in the world.
Yeah, it was, the huge amounts of balance sheet being thrown around by these places. So September 2008, they announced the merger between the two. There was a lot of controversy around that, because when you looked at the share ratio, do you remember, Damian, that when you looked at the share ratio of Lloyd's taking over HBOS, it was pricing underneath where HBOS had already raised money earlier in the year.
Yeah.
And that's a bit of a kind of no from capital markets. But that's
the bank shares were ridiculously volatile. Excuse me, moving around 25-30% a day.
No one with hindsight needs that even pointing out. But from the point of foresight in the moment in 2008, looking forward, that's like, that's so shocking. That's so shocking. But of course, we know what happened.
Yeah.
And in January 2009, the takeover was finalized. So that's why I think the October 2008 email about, it's okay to use the motivation cards for Christmas gifts, we've checked, is so interesting, because you've got these guys in and I don't know, but I as I understand it, she was up in Yorkshire, I guess, in the Halifax heartland, if you like. Working on in the complaints area. Maybe you're not as in touch with what's going on down at the sharp end in London, I would say. So, your sensitivity to, reputation risk, and also how people are feeling about
the optics of what things look like.
The optics of spending money on Christmas gifts for your colleagues, under the £25 limit or whatever in October 2008. That's a perk that you don't want to lose, or you don't want to lose for your team. And that's kind of interesting. And then when we move to the actual investigation taking place in early 2009, well, I'm somebody that lost their job in early 2009, or was it December 2008? Because again, there's that ambiguity of, when did I lose it? I know absolutely when I was marched out of the bank. But it was an absolute car crash. And it was me, along with many other people, because the bank at that time that I was working at, mighty Deutsche Bank, was desperately trying to, you get
headcount down.
Get headcount down like crazy.
Control,
And that's what I'm sure was happening at Halifax Bank of Scotland. I don't think Rachel Reeves was, one person walking out of the bank in May 2009. I'm sure she was one of very, very many. And really, when you have an investigation being conducted by internal audit, so it shows there isn't a formal investigation function at the bank at the time, I would say, then the fact that it wasn't followed through doesn't necessarily surprise me. I don't think it's great. I think it's bad optics now.
But now Lloyd's are in charge. I mean, have normally taken over. So you're a different entity. You're probably rebranding at the time. You can quite understand why people might go, look, actually, there's a bigger fish to fry out there.
Bigger fish to fry than also. I'm very, very sorry to say, £400 on a leaving meal, £152 on handbag and perfume, and then a number of gifts that may have gone on the motivation card, may have not. Obviously, I'm not taking a moral stance here. I'm just from a kind of, if I look back and I try and understand why this may not have been dealt with, or the way it was dealt with, then, and I just think it was a case of, do you know what? We need to just get on with the head count. And so she's taken out of the bank at that time as we said, as a good lever. I think now, interestingly though, the optics look terrible. And there's another side to this, Damian, which you and I sort of did discuss in brief, which is her position. Obviously now she's the Chancellor. She's Rachel Reeves. She's a PEP, politically exposed person.
She is, yeah.
But she's someone that, that there's some, kind of reputation behind. Was that the case? Did she therefore get special treatment back in 2009? It's a question, right? Because, she's Chancellor now. Where was she politically back in 2008, 2009? Well, close to my home and heart, we found out that in June 2006, she stood in the by-election in Bromley, Southeast London.
The venerable area of Bromley.
Yeah, I mean, it's a safe conservative stronghold. But anyway, she didn't succeed. But by May 2010, she was elected to Leeds West. And that seat, I understand, was handed to her really as part of an all-female shortlist for Labour to make sure that they got someone into that seat, into that safe seat. So it's a question for me, actually, about what was Rachel Reeves, the potential politician, looking like back in 2008-9.
Well, she definitely had political aspirations, having stood and failed in Bromley, as you say.
Buying votes with handbags. No, sorry, that was a terrible allegation. No. But anyway, I think that it's such a great story. There's obviously so much more to come out. I think it's a story of its time, but its time has been brought to now. But I think the of its time being, gosh, the crossover of when this was raised with when the bank was going through such utter transition. Yeah. I think that, as you've observed, internal audit carrying out the investigation, because there weren't really investigation functions in the form that there are now at many of these places, many of these institutions. And it remains to be seen what else comes out. And I'm aside of all of this, I'm still asking the question, why now? What is it? Why now? Who is pushing this story and why? And where does this go? I think Keir Starmer has given her his full support.
Absolutely,
again.
Yeah. I think that's been a...
So, get your coat. No. So it'll be interesting to see where it comes out. So anyway, that's a bit of a whistle stop tour through whistleblow complaints, if you like. But I think, again, just to sort of, reiterate, a great story, a great case study because of the ambiguity around policy, the misunderstanding, and
the backdrop of what it's all up against. Absolutely, yeah.
Absolutely. What a great case. Well, we'll be back with more episodes from the Skadi podcast. Hope you've enjoyed this one. It's a bit on the fly, a bit reactive, but we don't mind that. Absolutely. And I hope you've caught the new trailer from Alexandra Mexi. If not, watch it on Spotify, Apple as well. So anyway, till next time, thank you for joining us on the Skadi podcast.
Thanks, everyone.
You've been listening to the Skadi podcast, featuring Nic, Corry and Damian Taylor. This podcast is produced by me, Alexandra Mexi. If you found today's episode interesting, you want to be a friend of the show and interact with like-minded people, you should join the Skadi Discord. Our chat community is a big treasure trove of information where you can find all the materials we use to produce our podcasts. If you want to listen to more episodes, then simply search the Skadi podcast on any streaming platform. Feel free to connect with us at Skadi Limited on LinkedIn to read about our research and business relation to anti-financial crime and control functions. Until next time, thank you for listening.